All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Yeah.
Um, we love a good ghost story,
Always up for a good haunting.
right? And this one is a classic.
Oh, yeah.
This one is like the queen bee, so
Hmm.
to speak, of haunted locations.
The grand dame of spectral shenanigans.
Yes, and that is the RMS Queen Mary.
Ooh, the Queen Mary.
So for anybody who is unfamiliar with the Queen Mary, she's this massive ocean liner.
Absolutely.
It was built way back in the 1930s, and cruised around the Atlantic.
The epitome of luxury travel back then.
Oh no, it was the way to travel.
Yeah.
If you were rich and famous.
Right. Stars of stage and screen royalty, all the big names.
Exactly, and she even played a super important role in World War II.
Ah, yes, she was transformed into a troop ship.
Yeah, she was painted gray and nicknamed the Gray Ghost.
I love that name. So fitting.
Right, because she was carrying all these soldiers across the Atlantic, kind of in secret.
Really a fascinating chapter in her history.
It is, and nowadays you can find her docked permanently in Long Beach, California,
Yeah.
where she operates as a hotel and museum and tourist attraction.
A floating piece of history and a popular destination.
But it's also got this really spooky reputation.
This is where the deep dive gets interesting, right?
Yeah, because over the years there have been all these reports of paranormal activity on the Queen Mary.
Of tons of stories and legends.
Right, and people claim that it's one of the most haunted places in America.
Definitely a contender for that title.
So the big question is, is the Queen Mary really haunted?
Right. Are these stories just, tall tales or is there actually something more to it?
Exactly, and that's what we're going to dig into today.
Let's set sail on this investigation, shall we?
So to start, let's talk about the ship's history, because it's a pretty long and kind of interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, she sailed for decades across the Atlantic, carrying all sorts of people.
Yeah, over 1,000 voyages.
More than 1,000. Think of all the stories within those journeys.
I know, and during that time there were, as you might expect, there were some deaths on board.
Yeah, around 49 deaths were officially recorded during her time as an ocean liner.
49, that's not insignificant.
No, especially considering the time period and the nature of transatlantic travel back then.
Right, but here's where it gets really interesting. The number of alleged ghosts haunting the ship is supposedly way higher.
Oh, yeah, I've heard it said that there are something like 150 different ghosts on board.
150.
That's a pretty big jump from 49.
Right, so what do we make of that discrepancy?
Well, I think it speaks to how these stories grow and evolve over time. You have this grand old ship with a rich history, both clamorous and a bit somber, and people start sharing these experiences, these tales, and then they get passed down, embellished, maybe even exaggerated.
It's like a game of telephone with ghosts.
Exactly. And the more time passes, the more those stories can take on a life of their own.
And I think the Queen Mary's wartime service probably plays a role in this too.
Oh, absolutely. The gray ghost carrying soldiers through dangerous waters. There's bound to be some lingering energy, some emotional residue from those times.
It just adds to the mystique.
For sure. So let's dive into some of the specific types of paranormal activity that people have reported on the Queen Mary.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? What kind of spooky shenanigans are we dealing with?
Well, pretty much the whole gamut of classic ghost story tropes.
Hit me with it.
So you got your visual sightings.
Like seeing an actual ghost?
Yeah, people report seeing shadowy figures darting about or catching glimpses of people dressed in period attire who then vanish into thin air.
Oh, spooky.
Then there's the auditory stuff, unexplained noises.
Like what kind of noises?
Well, like screams echoing in empty hallways or doors slamming shut on their own. Even things like the sounds of children playing and laughing in areas that haven't been used for that purpose in decades.
Creepy kids. Those are the worst kind of ghost kids.
They really are.
So seeing things, hearing things, but it doesn't stop there, right?
No, it goes beyond just sight and sound.
Okay. I'm on the edge of my seat here.
People also talk about sudden temperature changes, like walking into a cold spot, even though there's no logical explanation for it.
The classic cold spot.
Exactly. And then there are reports of unexplained smells.
Like what, perfume or something?
Sometimes perfume, yeah. But also things like cigar smoke in areas where smoking's been banned for years.
Oh, that's a bit more specific.
It is. And then, of course, you have the classic disappearing act, ghostly figures that people see one moment and then poof, they're gone.
So basically, if you're looking for a good ghost story, the Queen Mary has got you covered.
Pretty much, it's like a spectral buffet.
All right, so are there any particular hot spots on the ship, places where these ghostly encounters seem to happen more often?
Definitely some areas have a stronger reputation for paranormal activity than others.
Like where?
Well, the area around the second-class swimming pool is one.
Ooh, I bet there's a story there.
Oh, there are several, but we'll get to those in a bit.
Okay, keep me in suspense.
And then there's stateroom B340.
I've heard of that one. That's like the celebrity ghost cabin.
Yeah, that one's pretty notorious. And then there's the shaft alley.
The shaft alley now, that sounds ominous.
It's this long, narrow passageway deep inside the ship.
I bet it's creepy down there.
Oh, you bet. And even some of the bathrooms connected to certain cabins seem to have their own ghostly tales.
So it's not just like one or two spots. The whole ship is pretty much a paranormal playground.
Pretty much every nook and cranny has a story.
Okay, well, let's start with stateroom B340, since that one's so famous.
All right, buckle up. This one's a classic.
Well, what makes this particular cabin so haunted?
Well, the most popular legend is that a third-class passenger named Walter J. Adamson died there in 1948.
Died in the room.
That's the story. But to be fair, the historical records don't actually confirm that he died in that specific room.
So it's more of a rumor than a fact.
It seems that way, but that hasn't stopped the stories from circulating.
Right, because people love a good ghost story.
Absolutely. And one of the creepiest accounts comes from a guest who stayed in B340 back in 1966.
Okay, what happened?
Well, they claimed that the bed covers were ripped off them in the middle of the night, and then there was this relentless knocking on the door, even though there was nobody out there.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
I hate when ghosts mess with my sleep.
Yeah, not exactly a restful night in a haunted cabin.
And there's something about smells too, right?
Yes, people will often report smelling cigar smoke and perfume in B340.
Even though nobody's smoking in there.
Exactly. Which is odd because, again, there's no real historical link to someone who would have been smoking cigars or wearing perfume in that particular room.
It's like the ghost is trying to leave its mark.
Maybe leaving a spectral calling card.
Okay, so that's stateroom B340, spooky stuff. But what about some of the other hotspots you mentioned, like the cleaning crew encounter?
Ah, yes, the Mauritania room incident.
Tell me more.
So this was back in 1989, and 3 members of the cleaning staff were tidying up the Mauritania room, which was a swanky lounge back in the ship's heyday.
Okay.
And they spotted a figure just sitting on the floor.
Like a person just hanging out?
Yeah, but when they asked the person to move, they got no response.
That's kind of rude.
Right, so they called security to come and check it out, but by the time security arrived, the figure had vanished.
Poof. Gone just like that.
Apparently, yeah, it's a classic disappearing ghost story.
I bet that freaked out the cleaning crew.
I'm sure it did. I wouldn't want to be cleaning a haunted ship.
No thanks.
Mm,
I'll stick to my nice, clean studio apartment.
a wise choice.
So it wasn't just the cleaning crew, right? Other people have had weird encounters on the Queen Mary?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's a story from 2001 involving an employee who worked in the Mayfair room.
The Mayfair room, what was that originally?
That used to be the ship's beauty salon, but it was later converted into an office space.
Okay.
So this employee arrived at work early one morning, and as they entered the Mayfair room, they felt this sudden chill and then saw a man dressed all in white walk right through a closed door.
What, a man in white just casually strolling through a wall?
That's what it's definitely one of the more bizarre stories.
I mean, that's pretty rude. You don't just walk through walls even if you're a ghost.
Some ghosts just have no manners.
Right. So we've got disappearing figures, we've got wall-walking ghosts. Any other spectral superstars we should know about?
Well, there's a fireman in blue coveralls.
The firemen in blue coveralls. Okay, that sounds intriguing.
This one's a bit sad. It said that he was a crewman who died during a fire drill when he got crushed by a heavy watertight door.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, a tragic accident. And now the legend is that his ghost haunts the very doorway where he died.
You know, that's one of the things that gets me about these ghost stories. It's like these are real people who lived and died, and sometimes their deaths were really sad or scary.
Yeah, it adds a human element to it. It's not just about spooky thrills, it's about the lives that were lived and lost in these places.
Exactly. It makes you think about the history and the weight of it all.
Absolutely. And speaking of history, we can't talk about the Queen Mary without mentioning the swimming pools.
Oh, yeah. The pools are always a popular spot for ghost stories on ships.
Definitely. And the Queen Mary has 2 main pools, the first-class pool and the second-class pool.
And they both have spooky stories attached to them.
It seems so people often report seeing wet footprints appearing and disappearing near the first-class pool, even though the deck is completely dry.
Phantom swimmers?
Maybe. And then there were the stories of children's voices being heard around the second-class pool and near the old third-class playroom and nursery.
Ghost kids again?
Yep. And these sounds are often linked to the story of a little girl who supposedly drowned in the second-class pool.
Little Jackie.
That's right.
That one always gets to me. It's so sad.
It is a tragic tale, whether it's true or not.
And are there any other ghosts we should be on the lookout for on the Queen Mary?
Well, there are a few others that pop up in the stories pretty regularly, like an engineer who died in the engine room and is said to still be down there tinkering around.
A ghost engineer. That's a new one.
And then there's the classic woman in white who seems to appear in a lot of different locations on the ship.
Of course, a woman in white. Always got to have a woman in white.
It's a staple of ghost stories.
So we've got a whole cast of characters here. Ghost children, a fireman, an engineer, a woman in white.
It's like a spectral party.
But we should probably acknowledge that not everyone believes in ghosts.
Of course not, and it's important to be skeptical and to consider other explanations for these experiences.
So what are some of the more down-to-earth explanations for what people might be seeing and hearing on the Queen Mary?
Well, there are a few things to consider, like pareidolia.
Pareidolia, what's that?
It's that phenomenon where our brains see patterns or faces in random things, like seeing a face in a cloud or a bunny rabbit in a stain on the wall.
Oh yeah, I do that all the time.
And it's thought that this might play a role in some ghost sightings, especially in a place like the Queen Mary with its unique architecture and shadows and all sorts of interesting shapes.
So our brains are just trying to make sense of things.
Exactly. And then there's the power of suggestion.
How does that work?
Well, if you go into a place with the expectation that it's haunted, you're more likely to interpret things in a spooky way.
So if you're already primed to see a ghost, you might see a ghost, even if it's just a coat rack in a dark corner.
Pretty much our minds can play tricks on us.
And I think the atmosphere of the Queen Mary itself probably contributes to this too.
Absolutely. It's an old ship. It creaks and groans and has this undeniable air of history.
It's got atmosphere for days.
Exactly. So even if there weren't any ghost stories attached to it, it would still be a pretty spooky place just by virtue of its age and the fact that it's a giant ship out on the water.
It's funny because the Queen Mary hasn't exactly tried to downplay its haunted reputation.
No, they've kind of embraced it.
They've gone all in on the ghost tourism.
Exactly. They have those Haunted Encounters tours and the Grey Ghost Project tours, and they really play up the spooky factor.
It's smart marketing, I
Yeah.
guess. If you got a haunted ship, might as well make the most of it.
Right, and it's a way to keep people interested in the ship and its history.
But it's interesting because even on these tours, they sometimes present information from the ship's logs that contradicts some of the more popular ghost stories.
Yeah, that's true. They try to balance the entertainment aspect with the historical facts.
Which brings us to the question of historical evidence.
Or the lack thereof in some cases.
Right, because there are all these great ghost stories. But when you start digging into the actual records, things get a little murky.
Yeah. For example, there's no real historical evidence to support the story of a murder in stateroom B340.
Really, even though it's one of the most famous stories about the ship.
It is, but there's nothing in the logs to suggest that a murder ever happened there.
And what about little Jackie, the girl who drowned in the pool? Is there any record of that?
Nope, no record of any drowning in the pools during the Queen Mary's time as an ocean liner.
That's strange. You'd think something like that would be documented.
You would, especially since Cunard, the company that owned the Queen Mary, was known for keeping meticulous records.
So where do these stories come from if there's no evidence to back them up?
Well, it's possible that they're based on real events, but they've been embellished over time.
Like a game of telephone we talked about.
Exactly. Details get changed, stories get exaggerated, and after a while, it's hard to separate fact from fiction.
And I wonder if the rise of ghost tourism has anything to do with it.
I'm sure it does. When the Queen Mary was converted into a tourist attraction, there was probably a lot of pressure to create a compelling narrative.
And ghost stories are always a good way to draw a crowd.
Especially on an old ship like the Queen Mary.
So maybe some of the stories were invented or exaggerated to make the ship seem more haunted.
It's possible we may never know the true origins of all the legends.
And the Queen Mary has had its share of financial troubles over the years.
Oh yeah, it's a very expensive ship to maintain.
Right, so maybe the ghost stories are part of the effort to keep the ship afloat, so to speak.
Yeah, they definitely bring in tourists and generate revenue.
It's a weird situation, right? Because on the one hand, we have these fascinating ghost stories, and on the other hand, we have the very real challenges of preserving a historic ship.
And those two things are kind of intertwined now.
So is the Queen Mary really haunted? I guess we still don't have a definitive answer.
Not really. It's up to each individual to decide what they believe.
But I think we can all agree that it's a pretty spooky place.
Oh yeah, with a rich history and a whole lot of mystery.
Well, folks, that's our deep dives into the Queen Mary, a ship full of history, glamour, and maybe just maybe a few ghosts.
Thanks for joining us on this spectral voyage.
If you liked this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to our show and leave us a review.
And if you've ever had your own spooky encounter on the Queen Mary or anywhere else, we'd love to hear about it.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the mysteries of the world.
And don't forget to keep an eye out for those ghosts.
You never know where they might be lurking.
Happy haunting, everyone.
See you next time.